Okay. How are you today?
I'm very good, thank you. How about you?
Yeah, very well, thanks. Very well. Yeah, yeah.
Good.
Yeah, so I don't really have much of an idea of where I want to go with this conversation. I just kind of wanted to speak to you because I've been following your work for a while and really found a lot of value in what you've been exploring. I loved Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. I devoured that series like you wouldn't believe. Like I just wanted to get to the next episode. Really enjoyed a lot of not only the content that you presented, but also the style. Like to me, it felt like you were very alive with the
Mm,
ideas as they were unfolding, and there was a presence to you when you presented it, and yeah, I really enjoyed that. And also, untangling the world knot of consciousness and the elusive I, what you're doing most recently, like all of that stuff just fascinates me, and yeah,
I'm glad. I'm glad to hear that. Thank you for saying that. It's very encouraging and helpful to me.
yeah. So I wanted to just get to understand who you are, who John Vervaeke is. So what what um what brought you to cognitive science as a field?
What brought me to cognitive science as a field is that I I had been pursuing philosophy uh, largely because when I met the figure of Socrates in first year university, it inspired me. Uh, I began an aspirational path uh, to try and better follow Socrates and the love of wisdom,
Mm.
which I hope doesn't sound too pretentious. I'm just stating an aspiration like he did himself.
Mhm.
Um, but the problem with academic philosophy is that until very recently, the topic of wisdom, which is at the core of the word philosophy by
Mm.
Leah Sophia, drops off the table, and you get involved in this other project. Now, this other project, it has its own inherent value. The project of sort of meta science and meta culture and meta ethics, and that's valuable. You get valuable tools, and it's an important thing to do. So I'm not denigrating it, but it did not satisfy the original reason why I entered philosophy.
Yeah.
So after I did my MA, I actually dropped out for a year because I was very disillusioned. Um, but I started taking up because I wasn't finding what I needed within the Western tradition. I started taking up Tai Chi Chuan and Vipassana meditation and meta contemplation. And I was starting to go through these transformative experiences. And then about that time, I became aware of this new discipline called cognitive science, where they were initially starting to talk about the mind in ways that were much more um, conducive to affording transformation.
Mm.
And then I found that although philosophers at that time were not talking about wisdom very much anymore, psychologists and cognitive scientists and neuroscientists started talking about it. And then cognitive science was more and more shifting into what's now called 4E cognitive science, emphasizing how embedded, embodied, enacted, and extended cognition is, and how issues of meaning are central. And then, right, as I was entering into this, more and more, what happened is my interest in wisdom and the direction of cognitive science were both moving, and they moved more
Yeah.
and more towards each other like that.
Yeah.
And so I find the interdisciplinary approach to understanding sense making and meaning making within cognitive science to be importantly similar to what we would now consider the very interdisciplinary approach of people like Plato and Aristotle, the Stoics, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very cool. And I've heard you mention previously somewhere that you were involved in the Christian church as a young man.
Yeah, well, that's how I ended up meeting Socrates.
Mm.
I was brought up in a fundamentalist form of Christianity, and it's taken me some significant amount of therapy, some significant amount of of my practices, a significant amount of time of reflection, a significant amount of help from friends, to come to a more balanced appraisal of that. Because when I initially left it, I left it for reasons I would now call because it was having a traumatizing effect on me. It was very traumatic.
At what age was that you left?
About 15,
Right.
sort of the prototypical age, right?
Yeah.
And I've come to appreciate the value of the exposure to Christianity. I often use the analogy, just like English is my mother tongue, and I will always carry it with me. Christianity was my mother religion, and I'll always carry it with me. So it's given me a taste for self-transcendence. It's given me a taste for aspiration. It's given me a taste for internalizing the sage. Jesus was my first sage that was internalized. And all of these things I've come to deeply appreciate and be gracious for, and be gracious about, and be hopefully grateful for. But I also have come to realize how, and this I found has been the case for many people, their experience with Christianity has been traumatic, or at least neglectful or negligent to some significant degree.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean that all Christians are pursuing their Christianity that way. I'm not claiming that. I'm claiming what I experienced and what happened to me. And so I left, but that hunger that the mother religion had given in me was not going to just be simply denied in sort of militant atheism. And that's when I encountered the figure of Socrates, and I encountered somebody that gave me a different way of trying to love wisdom, afford self-transcendence, etc. And so, I mean, I mean, a lot of my life I've come to see, and even this has helped, been made clear to me presently in my current discussions with people like Paul Vanderklay and Jonathan Pajot, J.P. Marceau, Mary Cohen, even Jordan Peterson, is that I have these two sages within me. Jesus is my sage of agape, and Socrates is my sage of logos. And trying to, not so much trying, it's more how they are working themselves out in me, and I'm trying to figure out how to best conform to how they can best coordinate and cooperate and cohabitate within me. And I'm hopeful that can be helpful to other people, because I think you can understand a lot of the human endeavor for the good life to be one in which we are trying to realize, in both senses of the word realize, logos and agape, and how they belong together, which was the central project of sort of Platonic Christianity or Christian Platonism, however you want to describe a lot of the spiritual heritage, the mystical tradition within Christianity. There's similar things, of course, definitely going on within Buddhism with Dharma and Karuna, and similar things going on in Taoism. Those are the three that I feel comfortable talking about. I was brought up in Christianity, and then I've been doing Buddhist and Taoist practices for, I don't know, close to 3 decades. It's been 3 decades now. So
yeah, that's awesome. There's so many rich topics that you're touching on. I just want to give you a little bit of context for me and where I've come from in this conversation. So I have been a practicing Buddhist for about 6 years now. For me, finding the spiritual path was kind of through suffering, through some kind of existential crisis, looking around for some way to make sense of my life, and then stumbling across different podcasts and YouTube videos and things like that started to land pretty deeply in me as, this is, a way to make sense of life and find some meaning. I'd been meditating for a few years prior to that, so I had an understanding of the mechanisms of meditation, but my meditation teacher was an atheist and was coming at it from a scientific point of view, where it was simply a mechanism to find relief from stress and anxiety and things like that,
Yeah,
which was
right.
useful. But yeah, coming across some of these spiritual insights just in the written word made meditation much deeper and richer for
Of
me.
course.
Yeah,
You always have to embed an ecology of practices within a Philia Sophia,
yeah,
or you are denying yourself the depth of transformation that those practices could afford.
yes,
Yes, very much.
yes, yes, yes. Yeah, and
Oh,
then
so were you always called Maitreya then? I mean, because that's the coming
no,
Buddha. But
no, no.
you've taken on that
So
name.
I was born Matthew, yeah, and Maitreya was actually given to me by my current spiritual teacher, Vishrant.
So
Yeah,
you're one of Jung's second-born, the people who adopt a second name, indicating an important fundamental transformation. That's very cool.
yes, exactly right, exactly right. So I've been part of this community, I guess, now for 6 years, and it's under the umbrella of Buddhism, but it's not traditional Buddhism in the sense that
Yeah,
there's study of scripture and things like that. It incorporates a lot of Taoist elements actually as well.
yep, yep.
The yin and yang, and yeah, and so I've been with this teacher for 6 years, learning what he has to teach, and a lot of it really aligns with what you're talking about agape and wisdom and
Yep.
self-transcendence, self-transformation,
Yep.
Development of the psyche,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and the ecology of practices. Like my teacher would teach an ecology of practices.
Of
So
course, all
that,
good teachers do. All
yeah,
good teachers do.
yes, yes, yes. So that really resonates with me deeply. And also, in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, you were touching on things like higher states of consciousness and mystical
Yep,
states of consciousness,
yep, yep.
and what enlightenment is. And
Yeah.
that's really fascinating to me too, because my teacher is enlightened, and he's teaching a path towards enlightenment. So yeah, I'm
Can I ask you a question?
yes.
If I may interrupt you, because you just said something deeply provocative to me. I mean,
Sure.
I've met a couple people who I think legitimately claimed to be enlightened, and of course, I've read some text by people who claim to be enlightened. What I want to ask this question very carefully, and I would like your considered response to it.
Yeah.
What is it about him that gives you the trustworthy sense that he's enlightened?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah, that's a really good question. So
I'm asking it both as somebody who's on a path and as a cognitive scientist. So
yeah,
that's why the question is kind of a pivotal question for me.
yeah, yeah. To answer that question, I would have to come at it from a energy standpoint.
Okay.
So because to me, anyone can speak the words of enlightenment,
Sure.
spirituality,
Sure.
reality. You can't really judge someone on the words they use.
No.
It has to be to me on the presence.
They're
Uh,
present. Yeah, the
presence.
way they're so you feel a presence through the words. Is that
No,
correct?
well,
I
not through
understand.
the words. It doesn't have to be through the words. It can be just sitting in silence. There's
Right, but it can be through the words, but it
yes,
also can be in silent communing as well.
yes,
Right, right.
yes.
Sorry for interrupting, but I want to unpack the detail.
No,
The
no.
scientist is coming out right now.
Yeah,
Keep going,
absolutely.
please.
Yeah. So I've had a couple of experiences with Vishrant very early on in sitting with him in satsang, where my vision all kind of went white, started to go white,
Yes,
and he was in the room, and everything disappeared except for him.
right.
And
Became
then
super salient to you. Yeah,
yeah, and then even he disappeared, and there was just whiteness, and the energy in my body was super light and super vibrant.
right, right.
Um, And that lasted for a few minutes and then went away. And then there was a separate incident a few weeks later where I was sitting in satsang again and was just meditating, and I had my eyes closed, and there was an energy that was very light and very nice. It was like blissful almost, vibrating in my sort of solar plexus or stomach area, and then
Right here. Yeah, right,
even lower, so probably down to the navel.
Right near the Dantian then, right near the
Yes,
Dantian.
yes,
Right.
that's where it started, and then it became stronger and stronger, and came up and up, and into my chest, and then into my neck, and then further into my forehead, and to the top of my head. And I had my eyes closed this whole time, and things were happening around me, but I was just really, really intrigued by this sensation in my body. And then I felt like a pull on my forehead here.
Yeah.
And it was almost like someone had a fishing hook and stuck a fishing hook in my forehead and was pulling on the fishing line. That was how strong it was. And then at some point I opened my eyes and things started to slowly return to sort of normality. And those two experiences for me were foundational, because I've always been trying to get back to those two experiences. I've never had experiences as strong as those two. But sitting in his presence even today, I still feel a lightness of energy, and my mind will quieten down to some degree. And
did you feel that the second experience, the third eye, did you feel that that was somehow connected to him in some fashion, or?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
That would be my guess, but again, it's just a guess. And you know, I've read about other spiritual experiences, and I can only guess as to what was happening there. But I would say that it was almost like the chakra here was opening, and the sensation of pressure.
Yeah. So this is very interesting for me, and sorry, I don't mean to derail things the way you might plan, but this is genuine Dialogos for me. So if I'm understanding correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because I want to know. I don't want to be right. I want to know.
Yes.
Right? It sounds to me like you're saying you have a trustworthy sense that this person is enlightened because of his capacity to trigger in you these kinds of profound experiences of realization. So it's not just what he says, but somehow he is having, for lack of a better word, a symbolic effect on you that is deeply transformative. So your knowing of him and the transformation in your self-knowledge are bound together in some very intimate fashion. Am I understanding you correctly?
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. So, and the self-transformation that I've experienced during my time with him is also testament to to that same energy.
And do you see other people around him also going through similar kinds of transformations?
Yes.
I know you're not doing this as a scientist, so I hope I'm not being intrusive, but this proposal I think is a very valuable one, because a lot of the attempts to understand of enlightenment are done internally. What's it like inside the mind? But then we try to decide from that whether or not the person's enlightened. But one of the things you're saying, right, is no. But one of the things you could look at is like the enlightened people have this kind of effect on people around them, and we should be paying attention to that. And I think that's a very, like, he's triggering this deep kind of participatory self-transcendence in you, and in a way that you and others are finding enlivening and enriching of your lives. Is that fair to say it that way?
Definitely fair. Yes, absolutely.
Wow, thank you for that. That's very helpful to me. I hadn't sort of put those pieces together in the right way. That's very helpful for my understanding. So I'm sorry for hijacking this. I'll turn things back over to you, but I really wanted to follow
it's
that
not
up.
hijacking at all. I actually want to participate in a dialogue with you, Dialogos, if we can manage it. But I want things to be free flowing. I don't necessarily want this to be an interview where I'm just asking you questions.
Sure. Okay, great. Great.
Yeah, because I'm fascinated by the same things you're fascinated by. It
Yes.
intrigues me as much as it does you, and the questions that you're asking in me provoke the curiosity in me, because I've asked myself the same questions. You know, you look online for enlightened masters, and you find people like Adyashanti and Muji and Gangaji and various other awake people around the world. For me, it has to be the final test of whether someone's awake or not has to be an energy phenomena in some sense. It has to be the presence of the person.
The presence of the person with the power to transform others that come into that presence.
Yes.
And they're not, and that is freely given. It's agapically given. It's not being used to manipulate.
Yes.
Or
yes.
Like, because people can confuse, I think they can confuse the presence of someone who's awakened with the charisma of somebody who's very, very sharp, right? And those aren't the same thing, right? Those aren't the same thing.
Yeah.
But that's very, very interesting. So I think I want, I mean, one way I think scientia, which is where we get science from, but originally means knowledge, right? And sapientia, wisdom. I want to get them back together. And so one thing I try to do is I try to ask questions that come from both.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's really, really interesting.
Yeah.
Well, what would I don't have much more to say right now, because that was a lot. I mean, about that topic, there's lots more to talk about. But yeah, I think when two people can start to come to things together that they couldn't come on their own, that's when Dialogos is starting to take shape.
Yeah.
So we were having a bit of Dialogos there, where something was catching fire between us and self-organizing. That's what Dialogos feels like.
Yes, totally, absolutely, and I love that when I can drop into that flow and things just emerge of their own accord. It's not necessarily anything that I'm doing, but something is emerging by itself, and I'm participating in it.
Yeah, very much, very much.
Yeah,
very much.
Yeah, that's another thing that just, participatory knowing that I feel very strongly about.
Well, you're exemplifying it. You're exemplifying it so much. You know, when there's that interpenetration of self-knowledge and self-transcendence and knowledge of the other and its self-disclosure, that at that level, the fundamental level of your identity machinery, that's participatory knowing. That's participatory knowing. And you were exemplifying it there, which is why I tend to find, well, I tend to be attracted, I hope, with good justification, towards people who are speaking from that and not just speaking from their propositions.
Yes.
And that's something I've learned from Socrates.
Yeah.
To seek out that kind of participation.
Yeah.
So yeah, you were exemplifying it.
Yeah, and it is so much richer than propositional knowing, because it's based on experience. You experience something and it transforms you. You can then speak it because you know it to such a depth.
Yeah, you know, it comes with a kind of self-intimacy and other intimacy that propositional knowing doesn't carry. Yeah, I'm trying, I mean, in the work I'm doing, I'm trying to, part of what I think wisdom consists in is the proper alignment of the propositional, the procedural, the perspectival, and the participatory. And I'm wondering if people who we regard as awake or as or enlightened or even just wise, although I don't think you can really separate those, the degree to which they're helping people align those properly.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'm interested, just as a curiosity question, your exploration of the self has been really fascinating. I really like the episode where you're talking about the two academic papers that were published in 2017, one with the self exists and one with the self doesn't exist. The amount that they agreed upon about the machinery that makes up the self, and then just the conclusion is different. I find that fascinating. I I would be curious to know your thoughts on the ego, what the ego is, how the ego plays into the self and our experience of life, and
Sure.
how it plays into self-transcendence.
Yeah, I mean, that's a that's a difficult one to answer simply, and I'm not trying to do the usual academic thing, but because the ego means many different things. That's the problem. It's a very equivocal term.
Yeah.
Um, so I'll stipulate how I'm using it, and if that resonates enough with you, we can go forward. If it's too disconnected from what you
Yeah.
think, then we can talk about what it is you're referring to. Okay. Um, um, so for me, I mean, this is still, I mean, this is still very much a work in progress because, I mean, I'm doing it with Greg Enriquez and Christopher Mastropietro, and
Yeah.
I'm trying to actually exemplify as well as explain, right? We're trying
You
to
are.
exemplify.
You definitely are. Yeah. It's beautiful, some of
Thank you
those
very much.
episodes.
Yeah, well, for me too. Um, the ones that are coming, I mean, the one that came out last week, Greg, the second part of Greg's argument is amazing. And then Chris has one where he takes center stage and he brings in Kierkegaard and the whole existential question of the self, the
Mm.
existential religious question of the self. And that's just a whole nother dimension. And it's
Yeah.
so rich and juicy, it's right. So for me, I mean, we were talking, the idea you've got this seat of consciousness which you can move around, the place from which you're eyeing
Mhm.
I, and also playing with the I metaphor, right? The
Mhm.
from which you're doing the perspectival knowing, right? When you move around, and when you move around, you activate different aspects of your agency, and then different me's are disclosed, and different corresponding elements in the world are disclosed. So all of that's going on, um, and I tend to think of the ego as a narrative situating of the seat of consciousness
Mhm.
that often claims to have exclusive authority over my agency.
Mm. Mm. Yeah.
And so that is why I've also embarked on this. I mean, I have a tremendous, so the ego needs to be appropriately respected because of the tremendous power of narrative.
Mm.
And narrative makes us temporally extended moral agents. We can't come to personhood. This is why the ego thinks it's in charge,
Yeah.
of your agency, because it does so much. And we know there's even a part of the brain that tries to take credit for everything you do in a narrative fashion. Oh, I did that, and it'll confabulate some story as to why you did what you did,
Mm.
right? And you can see it overactive in certain psychopathologies. So it has this powerful function, and so I think I think attempts to eradicate the ego move off of what a Buddhist would call the middle path. I think that's asceticism, right? Where so for me, it's to again to properly resituate to renegotiate its functionality. You get this from psychotherapies like IFS, internal family systems theory, where you find a part and it's malfunctioning, and you don't try to eradicate it. You try and get it to restructure
Mm.
so that it regains its appropriate functionality,
Mm.
or acquires a new and better functionality.
Mm.
And so when you're in, so for me, to give people a sense of what I want to talk, I want to talk about something that's at least universally accessible because it's a universal phenomena, which is the
Mm.
flow state. Now,
Yeah.
when we're in the flow state, one of the things that people reliably report is that narrative seating of consciousness that is trying to create a narrative and take credit for all of your agency drops away.
Mm.
And what you discover is actually a super enhanced agency, your agency and your at one-ment and your connectedness while you're in flow. And
Yes.
so you realize, oh, wait, my sort of ego, my narrative centering of the seat of consciousness and my identification through that with my agency, that is not what it claims to be, right? It is not
Mm.
the it is not equivalent to, it is not the final or constitutive authority of
Mm.
my agency.
Mm.
And so for me, that's when people, and this is used in transpersonal psychology, that's when you get transegoic experiences. And I think there's a important difference between a transegoic experience and the attempt to say that, that I'm completely egoless. The people, I understand what people sometimes mean by that. They mean that in that state, the ego is no longer, active or dominating. But to claim they can give up the functionality of narrative in their life, I find that a claim I cannot believe.
Yeah.
Because there's no evidence in their lives of these people that they have given up, moral agency, the way narrative gives them a sense of time, like that hasn't gone away. What I think they mean is a transegoic experience in which that function has been reintegrated into a more comprehensive and expansive sense of agency. I don't know if that gels with anything or lands with you very well, but that's how I think about it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense to me. I've always thought of the ego as the identified part of the mind. So that narrative links into that. It's something that takes credit, something that likes to think that it has the authority over agency because it's making all the decisions. It's in the seat of control. Yeah, and I've had experiences of the flow state. One of the most tangible experiences of the flow state for me has been playing cricket.
All right, of course, yeah.
We play a lot of cricket here, and I used to play, a hell of a lot years ago, and I would get into the flow state batting because I would be just, focused on the ball coming out of the bowler's hand, and everything else would melt away. And the best innings I would have would be, I wasn't really doing anything. It was all just happening by itself. And I was just kind of there to experience it,
And so so the flow experience is one of those transegoic. Another one is the experience of awe. Because if you ask people what's happening in awe, you can even get them to draw it. Their sense of self is shrinking. Now, for most times when people are having that, they find that traumatic and horrible. But in awe, they find the shrinkage positive. I think there's deep connections between the flow state and the awe state.
Yes.
There's also something I'm reflecting on about right now about the flow state. I wonder if I might share that with you.
Yes.
And ask you, because you're a meditator, if this lands or resonates. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But so, I mean, I've done a lot of work and I've published on Csikszentmihalyi's Sense of Flow, and I get a lot about it. But most like cricket or other like sparring, right, or jazz, right, you're in what I call the hot flow state. There's tremendous metabolic expenditure, right? But I've noticed when I'm doing Tai Chi Chuan or in some of my contemplative practices, I get into what I would call the cool flow state.
Yeah.
I'm in flow, but I'm not burning all of this metabolic calorie, right? It's a much more yin form of flow as a yang form of flow. Has that ever happened to you?
Yeah, definitely. I do Tai Chi myself. I've been a Tai Chi teacher, for a few years, and Tai Chi, I've experienced that cool flow state where, it's just the breath and the movement of the hands and the weight subtly, and I've experienced that cool flow state just meditating. Like when the mind quietens down and that constant background chatter isn't there, that's what it feels like. It feels like just being present to the breath and body.
Yeah, you're flowing with things, but you're not doing this. Like they're both good. You should. I'm enough of a Taoist to think you should have both the yang and the yin forms of flow. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that, because I'm just like this is something about flow that I'm now I've done a lot of work with Leonardo Ferraro and with Harriet Bennett on sort of the cognitive machinery of flow. But now I'm going back to the phenomenology and trying to say, I think the phenomenology is richer than sort of the prototypical examples. And of course, Western scientists would really emphasize the yang flow, because Western science is very much about and intervening and not very much Gelesenheit. But so thank you for sharing that, because that's
to me there's something of value the flow state, but also in those states where the ego isn't as present, let's say,
Yes.
just use that as a thing. And there's something about mystical states of consciousness where that's true of any mystical state of consciousness, and higher states of consciousness, the ego seems to be backgrounded to some degree, like it's not foregrounded.
Yeah, very much.
There's something valuable about getting into those states and finding those states more and more often.
Yeah, I think what it affords, I mean, so I proposed this in The Elusive I with Greg and Chris, is so this idea that this one of the functions of the self is self-relevance, the way it glues everything together. And because we're inherently cultural beings, and it's not just how things are relevant to us, but how we're relevant to other things and other people, I think it's possible to exact that self glue and use it, go this way with it, and use that machinery to glue the world together more, rather than gluing yourself, right? And then you get that tremendous sense of of revelation, of disclosure, of sort of the fundamental oneness or connectedness of the world. And that can, I think, really improve our sensitivity, our ability to look for deeper patterns in reality. So I think that is deeply important to cultivate that.
Yeah, and there are enlightened people that will report that that is their experience. They don't really experience the self being here in the body.
No,
they experience the oneness all of the time. Like the oneness is their prevailing experience of the world.
And of themselves, I would say, but they don't want to say self because that usually refers to this egocentric sense. But if we have they have sort of an ontocentric, like you know how we talked about how the self-knowing and the other knowing are deeply enmeshed in participatory knowing? I think for awakened, enlightened people, they have become well nigh identical, right? So there's no deep distinction now between the machinery of self-knowing and the machinery of world knowing. They've now become completely interpenetrated.
Yes, I would say that's true. Yeah, for sure. And that to me is really, really fascinating, because it's like, okay, so if we can start to say things about what enlightenment is and what the experience is like, and there's commonalities that are reported between different enlightened people, and there's agreement from those around them that observe them in their daily lives that yes, these are ways in which they live their life, then to me it seems possible that we can develop an ecology of practices that can accelerate our transformation to get closer and closer to higher states of consciousness, mystical states of consciousness, enlightenment.
Yep. I think that's right. That's why I brought up the first question, getting an appropriate set of criteria by which we would identify such people. Because I get a sense of honesty from you. So if we're honest, there are lots of charlatans.
Absolutely. Right. Yeah.
Right.
And which why it's so important to the first question you asked about how can you tell your teacher's enlightened? What makes you think that? It's very important to watch your teacher. If you're going to be with a teacher, to watch your teacher closely and be very, very careful before trusting them, because you don't want to trust someone prematurely, because that's dangerous.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. The thing I would say about that is, so I'll say it this way, which will be a little bit bold, but hopefully in a friendly, provocative manner. Just because somebody is a great artist doesn't mean they can explain to you the cognition of art.
Yeah.
And just because somebody is enlightened doesn't mean they necessarily can explain to you the cognitive science of enlightenment.
Yes.
Right? Now, it's equally hubristic to confuse the cognitive science with enlightenment. I agree. So somebody who's studying enlightenment shouldn't thereby think, well, just by studying it, I'll become enlightened. That's hubristic. But I think I've heard some hubris on the other side, which I think is, right, well, I'm enlightened, so I have sort of omniscient knowledge of how my cognition works. I don't believe that's true.
Mm.
And so I think for me, an additional marker, and this might be more challenging for some more traditional schools, but I think it's the marker we need today, is if the enlightened person is very much open to learning the cognitive science.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, yeah. See
Because I've met somebody who was,
yeah,
and it was very interesting. Because I was actually sort of talking to him and interviewing him, but it turned around that he, and this doesn't mean anything about me. It turned more about him interviewing me. He wanted more of the knowledge and the concepts and
yeah,
right,
yeah, 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 yeah.
right. And it's like, and so for me, that was like, that was an additional marker for me, that this person isn't confusing enlightenment with science, because they are not the same thing. And that, so that respect should go in both directions, of course, right?
Yeah.
The scientists shouldn't think that because they've studied something, they've also realized it. Those are not the same thing.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you think about that? How does it?
Yeah, well, that question strikes me as very provocative. If the enlightened person would be open to exploring the cognitive science,
Yeah.
um, yeah, because I think about my teacher and other teachers that I'm familiar with, and they will really dedicate their lives to teaching practices that can help students on their journey.
And that's great. But I make a case, and you watch the series. I made this case. There's a you shouldn't confuse the language of teaching and the language of explaining. Those aren't
Mhm.
those aren't the same thing, right?
Mhm. Yes.
And I'm both a teacher and a scientist, so right.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't think, at least my teacher would be attempting to explain, really.
No,
He'd be attempting to teach. And he's quite pragmatic about the way he teaches. So it's what's going to get
that's
the
fine.
result, yeah.
I wonder if he would see a value in an explanation because of how it could contribute to the project you were talking about earlier, about getting clear about how to find people and build ecologies of practices around them. I mean, I'm not saying we should throw away tradition. If you followed any of my work, I'm not saying that.
Mm-mm-mm.
But I'm also saying that all traditions have to be living things. They have to adapt to
Mm-hmm.
what is learned.
Yes.
You can see, like you can watch the history of uh, awakened people and how they make use of the best
Yeah.
scientia of their time, right?
Yes.
That's been a reliable pattern.
Yes.
And the best scientia of our time right now, with respect to enlightenment, I would propose is cognitive science. Um, so
Interesting. Yeah. 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 When you use that term scientia, how are you using it in that sense?
So I want to include science, which I think is sort of the epitome of propositional knowledge. But
Mm.
I also want it to mean the other kinds of knowing. I want it to mean the epitome of skill knowledge that we call expertise, the epitome of perspectival knowledge, which you rightly call presence,
Mm.
and the epitome of participatory knowing, which is this capacity for transformative, you know, intensification of the connectedness between you and the world.
Mm. 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 Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. Well, I mean, in terms of the formal, I don't know how you would put this, but formal academia, I'd never come across anything like cognitive science before I watched Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. So
Well, that's too bad. Yeah, I think
yeah,
it's really important. Yeah,
yeah. I mean,
yeah,
I've always been fascinated by psychology, philosophy, different religions,
yeah.
but cognitive science was a new thing to me. And yeah, some of the concepts in cognitive science are incredibly rich. The four E's,
Yeah, yeah.
the way things are investigated and explained, I find very, very useful. So yeah, I mean that claim may well be true. Yeah.
Well, that's good because I mean, I think uh, I mean it would have to take place in philia, right? It would have to take place in friendship,
Yeah.
mutual respect, mutual coordination.
Yes.
Um,
Although, like when you invoke Socrates, one of the things that Socrates did really well was the challenging. And I think there's value in the challenging too
of
of
course,
yeah,
and it should be. It should be.
yeah,
Um, that's what I meant about philia, right? They should be willing to challenge each other,
I see.
but committed to being each other's best avenue of self-correction and self-transcendence.
Yes, 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 absolutely. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so um I'm curious in terms of your ecology of practices, like what are the practices you include in that currently?
So what my practices are I do um, well, there's some practices that are preparatory, there are some practices that are core, there are some practices that are bridging practices that help bridge between the core practices. But for example, I'll start with some yoga and some breathing exercises to get me into the right state.
Mm.
Then I do some Janjung, which is a kind of standing practice, um, and each one, which is a moving practice. These are all different kinds of sort of qigong.
Yeah.
Then I do Tai Chi Chuan. Um, then I sit, and then there's a bunch of practices that are designed to get me into um, to really stretch the attentional scaling and
Mm.
get me deeply embodied and engaged and inactive. And then I do a practice, a variation of Vipassana and a variation on sort of metta, combine them together in kind of prajna practice. Um, and then I do a practice drawn from Theurgia where you spend time cultivating kind of an archetypal figure. You see this in aspects of Tibetan Buddhism, right? And definitely in Taoism, and the sages, and you sort of invoke their presence to help you start to shift out of an egocentric frame and aspire. And then I do um, a Neoplatonic practice where um, I enter into participatory knowing of the levels of connectedness, starting with the level of emergence, and then the level of intelligibility, and then the level of consciousness, and then the level of oneness. And then you move into a kenosis practice, which is an emptying. You try and remove that from being self-centered, and move into what Nishitani called his definition of religion, the real self-realization of reality. That's actually the
Mm.
center.
Mm.
And then I generally often return to, and if there's any sort of in that sort of back to sort of taking that into a very present mindfulness, right? And then if there's any therapeutic, like if there's any part of me that needs to be spoken to,
Mm.
I do a version of IFS, internal family systems theory,
Mm.
therapy to get that. And then I move into Lectio Divina, and I read passages with Lectio Divina, sacred poetry, sacred prose. And then I read from two Neoplatonic texts, The Elements of Theology by Proclus, the Parasiphusion, The Division of Nature by John Scotus Erigena, and I do philosophical reflection on them. Then I do some Stoicism and practice active open-mindedness and a commitment to active open-mindedness. And then I end by reading some imaginal work. Right now I'm going through the work of Corban to really train the imaginal faculty to help me bridge all of this that I've been doing in my practice, integrate it with my experience of the world.
Mm.
And that's what I do every day.
Wow. That's a lot.
Well, and the thing is, like you have to spend quite a bit of time, like years,
Yeah.
in each one to some degree before you can bring them all together. So there's a lot that you have to do like along here
Mhm.
until you can then weave but they're talking to each other, hopefully
Yeah.
along the way. and then they get to know each other really well, and they start to weave together.
Yes.
And then, I preface that by going for a walk every morning. And when I go on my walk, I do a movement practice, a moving meditation practice and contemplation practice as I'm walking, to prepare for the more in-home practices. So
Yeah.
an in the world practice and an in-home practice, also to bridge between the two of them.
Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah, awesome. There's certainly a strong commitment to your practice. I mean, if you're doing everything you've just listed every single day, there's a strong sense of this means something to you.
It does. I mean, so the danger in that is to fall into kind of an engineering fallacy, that you're going to engineer your way in if I just build enough things in. And so I try to be very aware of that, and I try to let practices call me more than me just sort of, well, I'll take this and put it in here.
Yes.
Right? I try to do it dialogically. I let the practice call me, but I also try to rationally reflect on, well, where would it fit in? What would it counterbalance, and what would it condone, and what would it conduce, right? And so that it would genuinely not be an invasive species, but properly come to take up a life that enhances the entire ecology. So that's what I try to pay attention to.
Yeah, it's interesting you use the word engineering there, because one of the enlightened people out there at the moment is Sadhguru. Have you heard of Sadhguru?
No.
Okay, so he's Indian. He uses a terminology called inner engineering, which is essentially this. This, you can take a course of his and learn inner engineering, learn self-reflection, and learn the transformational practices to hopefully take you to higher consciousness, essentially.
And I mean, I don't want to criticize his training method because I don't know it.
Yeah.
But what I'm criticizing in my own, I mean, criticizing in the Socratic sense, right? Yeah. And so I make a distinction between dialectic, and this goes to the work of Tanabe from, the Pure Land tradition, where you make a distinction between Jiriki and Teriki, right? Self-power and other power, right? And so dialectic is self-powered. This is all those things I can learn to, enhance these connectedness and enter into communication and communion with things. But Dialogos is something I can't engineer. This is what I get most from Socrates and Plato. The logos has to take shape of its own accord, or it's not the logos. Yeah. If I've made it, it's not the logos, right? So I can do the dialectic, I can build this, but if you allow me to speak biblically, God has to breathe the breath of life into it. I can't do that, because if I do it, then it isn't connecting me to reality that's beyond me, and I'm just projecting. And so I try to make a deep distinction between the dialectic I do and the dialogos I receive and participate in.
Yeah, that makes sense. Absolutely. And so where are you trying to take yourself with these practices? What are you trying to achieve with these practices?
I mean, I want for myself and for other people to reduce self-deception and to enhance flourishing. That's all that's all. That's all I want. Well, that's what I aspire. I'm sure that I have egocentric and defensive and motivations that are at work, because I do not claim to be enlightened. But those that I aspirationally foreground, the motivations that I can aspirationally foreground and at least commit to with, I think, real sincerity, if not complete authenticity, but at least real sincerity, is that I really want to reduce my own suffering, distress and loss of agency, and the suffering of others. And I really want to afford flourishing, that sense of being connected deeply within and deeply without, and those two being connected with all. I mean, that's what I want for myself and others. And if you say, well, why do you want that? there is no why I want that.
Yeah.
That is the,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that's the only reason why we have a why, is to get to there. And once we get there, we should throw the why away.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so I hope that answers your question.
It did, yeah, absolutely. And yes, I love the way you spelled out self-deception in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, because
Right.
it is so prevalent and there is so much bullshit out there, and it is so hard to navigate. If you're attempting to navigate just on an intellectual level, it's so easy to get lost.
It's insufficient. It's
Yeah,
insufficient. It's not going to do it. Merely using your informational capacities are insufficient. You have to learn to engage and develop your transformational capacities
yeah,
if you're going to deal with the tsunami of bullshit that
yeah.
is ever increasing. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love that you also said, for myself and others, like you want to increase your own flourishing, you want to reduce self-deception in yourself, but then also for others to take up these practices and do that as well, because that brings back agape, it brings back love,
Yes.
and it
Yeah.
brings back heart, the care for others. And heart is something that my teacher teaches as a core part of
Yep. Yep.
his
Yeah.
teaching. He teaches the way of the heart, which is um, you know developing maturity, developing the ability to be responsible in the world, and having self-acceptance
Mhm.
and acceptance of the other, but then being able to take care of everyone around
Mhm.
and that is living the way of the heart, is being able to take care of everyone around you all the time. And that's a hugely aspirational thing to do, particularly
It
when
is.
we get caught ourselves. We go into reciprocal narrowing and from
Well,
time to time.
there, there's, I mean, pain, fear, and desire are the things that make us most egocentric.
Yeah.
At least that's been my experience,
Mm-hmm.
right? And there's a sense by which, why pain and hunger, they're naturally sort of set up to make us egocentric, because they're about trying to, preserve and save this.
Yes.
But the issue is, the issue for me, and this is easier said than done, and again, I'm not claiming to be enlightenment. I'm claiming to have learned some things. I'm
Yeah.
still in the process of learning, which is, right, to be able to discern, not just in words, but in awareness, to realize in discernment the difference between the intensity of that self-directedness and its veracity. The fact that it's such an intense thing doesn't mean that its claim is ultimately real or right, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so really getting to the point where you can sometimes, and I get glimpses of this, see through the egocentrism that your pain and your hunger drives you to.
Yes.
Again, don't try to my mind, don't try and like abolish that machinery, because that's like trying to kill yourself. And again, the Buddha rejected that as the pathway, right? Um, so it's like, yes, this has a place, but can I properly replace it within reality?
Mm.
And so that's, for me, that's my daily task. I mean, I'm going through right now where I'm really wrestling with this in my life, and trying to get those moments of clarity. The way the Buddha says, drop by drop the jar is filled, right? And just get those moments of clarity that take me a little bit farther, or Plato would have it, help me a little bit farther ascend out of the cave, right?
Yeah.
But for me, coming down to see that, like I tweeted something this morning. I very rarely tweet things. I just make announcements, but like something came to me, and it really sung to me in sort of at the heart of my own distress and the heart of my own practice, those two coming
Mm.
together.
Mm.
The thing, I put it this way: the thing we're avoiding at all costs has the power to cost us everything we love. And
Mm.
getting to the point where you can see that which you're avoiding at all costs is to see what you've empowered to potentially demonically destroy or cost you everything that you could love in
Mm.
your life.
Mm.
uh, and really trying to get to a place where you don't just think that like a proposition,
Yes.
but you know it as a person.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, try, and I think when we own up to our own, this is hard for me to say, when we own up to our own cowardice in the face of that, we are less likely to project it onto other people and treat them inappropriately. That is what I'm starting to see.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was helpful.
No,
But
that was great. That was fantastic. Yeah, absolutely. There's so much there that resonates for me. So the pain, the fear, the difficult sensations that we experience in daily life being our most identified or our most egoic states, and to wisely navigate those states. Absolutely. That's the most difficult obstacle on the path for me is navigating
yeah,
them.
because you come to realize how much, and it sounds trite to say it, but like how much you fear particular feeling states. Like you're like, no, I don't ever want to be in that feeling state ever again.
Yes, yes,
Right?
yes.
Which is to deny the fact that, yeah, maybe that feeling state was exaggerated, but it's to deny the fact that you have that feeling state capacity in you for a reason. It's there to do something.
Yeah.
And trying to build your whole life to avoid that, you're doomed. You're doomed to fail.
Yes.
Right? So for me, for example, I realized, and because I've been through some major grief, I've realized, and I think I want to tell you a story about the Buddha, because I've told it in other things, because
Yeah.
right, but right, because it's exactly about this. But let me first make this point, and then I'll tell the story. I'll give me a chunk of time here for a second.
Sure, go for
Right?
it.
Because I've come to realize that I've adopted a stance of I will avoid grief at all costs, and that's impossible. You're like right. You will lose every relationship either through separation or death. Right? So trying to avoid grief, and the Stoics are on about this too. And and I had all this language about it, and blah 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 blah. But then I was like, oh right, but here in my sort of right in the feeling, form, and functionality of my sense of self, I've built this. Nope, no grief at all costs.
Yeah.
Right. So now I want to tell you the story of the Buddha.
Yes.
So this woman came up to the Buddha, and her son had died, just died, infant son. And she's asking the Buddha to resurrect him, right? And he's, the Buddha refused to perform miracles, right? And so no, 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 no. But she's persistent. So eventually he turns to her and he says, okay, I'll bring him back to life, but you have to do one thing for me first. And she said, well, anything, of course, anything, at all costs, right? Said, I want you to go into town and you have to get a mustard seed from a household. And she said, well, that's easy to do. He said, one condition, you have to get it from a household that has never experienced grief. No one in the household has ever experienced grief. So she goes in and she knocks on the door. Do you have mustard? Yes, yes. Has anybody in this family experienced loss or grief? Yes, I lost my mother. Oh, and then she goes from door to door to door to door. And then after a while, she goes, oh. And then she goes back to the Buddha and she says, thank you. Because then she gets it. Then she gets it.
Yeah, yeah.
And that story has always been deeply meaningful to me. But there was still, and I'm not claiming that I've crossed this gap by any hubristic means, but there was still a gap between how deep this was and how deeply it touched me. And part of what I'm trying to do is to let the wisdom of that lesson get into the very, very core place where I am no grief at all costs, and trying to get, and as I'm saying it now, I can even feel the pain right here, trying to get those two, right? And to not turn away even though the pain is there.
Yeah, yeah. That to me, what you just put your finger on is the path.
Well, I mean, I think I wouldn't. I think it is. I think it's. I think we have other things. I mean, I think grief is one of the things. We also have things we pursue at all costs. Some people, right? But yeah, trying to get to some of those core places where we have empowered things to consume our love, That to me is becoming more and more central to my path, if you, and also to my theory. I'm trying to understand what kind of therapeutic interventions, how should we put together an ecology of therapeutic practices to best address that kind of way in which people get deeply stuck at the center of their heart.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's like all the practices in the world and all the therapies in the world and all the understanding cognitively in the world is not going to make someone turn towards grief if they don't want to.
Well, that's exactly that. It's like I forget which Zen patriarch said Zen enlightenment cannot be found by seeking, but it will never be found by people who do not seek.
Yeah,
Which
yeah,
which is right, which is perfect. It's again, you don't confuse the dialectic with the dialogos,
yes,
right?
yes, yes, yes. Yeah, absolutely. And to me, that's so. It's a really powerful way of getting down to something really, really fundamental. Like, if it's not the path in its totality, it's a large, large part of the path. Being able to accept extreme, extremely difficult pain, extremely difficult emotions inside of us, and allow those to pass through us um, with everything else that passes through us, with the joy, with the elation, with the love, with the bliss, with the boredom, with the sadness, with it all, having no barriers up to any of it.
Yeah, for me, like I said, it's not knowing it as a proposition, it's knowing it as a person. It's knowing it at the at the level of your identity first. So for me, I'll say something that's meant to be a little bit humorously provocative. I'm not on a quest for immortality. I'm on a quest for mortality. I'm on a quest to deeply realize my mortality.
Yeah,
Because for me, a mortal is a being that is subject to this kind of grief,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so this kind of vulnerability to existence.
Yes.
And so, yeah, for me, like this is what I mean about a kind of self-knowledge and a knowledge of reality are deeply interpenetrating. Really coming to know myself as a being that is subject to mortality, which doesn't just mean death, it means all these little deaths, right?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Uh, and knowing myself in such a way that that no longer blinds me to reality. That's what I aspire to. That's what I'm aspiring to right now in my practices.
Yeah.
And like I said, also in my theoretical reflections. For me, it's always a case of trying to realize in the practice and then trying to realize in the reflection on the practice what's going on.
Mm. Mm.
So I use theoria, which is the Greek word for contemplation, and theory. And theory came from theoria, right? The word. So I try and always have a dialogos between theoria and theory all the time.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. Yeah. 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 For me, this is where I struggle on the path constantly, over and over and over and over again, where I fail all the time, and it's being with my experience in the present moment, without defense, with that vulnerability, with that acceptance, um, and it's so easy to say, and it's so difficult to do in the heat of an argument with my wife, let's say, for example,
Yes.
where
Yes. Great example. Yes.
where all of my stuff is being triggered, all of my abandonment issues, all of
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
desire to be right and be validated and be
Yes.
appreciated, all of that survival mechanism stuff that's inside of us all is right at the surface. And having the skill and the capacity to hold that, not suppress it, but to
Right.
hold that
Right.
there,
Right.
be present with that, and also present with my wife, and be able to communicate effectively and stay open and stay, on her side.
Wouldn't it be heaven enough if you could just do that all the time? Wouldn't that be heaven enough for anybody? I would love if I could be that way with my partner all the time. For me, no, that's good enough. That is heaven enough for me. If I could get to that place with the people, like my partner and my kids and my friends, and even my students, like if I could be there, if I could live, if I could dwell there, the way the Bible talks about dwelling, if I could indwell there, that's heaven enough for me. That is heaven enough for me.
Yes, exactly right. So that's totally right. That would be heaven, and that would be amazing to be able to do that as a mortal person.
Yes.
And my teacher talks about the bhakti path and the jnani path, right? The path of devotion and love and heart, and the potion of practice and discipline and meditation, let's say. And you need both. You need both things to be able
logos and agape. You need logos and agape.
Yes, you need logos and agape. And so you can meditate and do self-inquiry and do all the practices on your awareness, your consciousness. But if you're not practicing it in an enacted way in your daily life with relationships that are important to you, practicing that openness, vulnerability, heart, then you're missing half of the practice. And that to me is the most difficult thing, to show up in relationships and to try and be open. It's so easy to say, it's so difficult to do.
Trying to be responsible without merely conceding or giving in to that adaptive machinery, while simultaneously being almost stereoscopically responsible to the other person who also has their own adaptive functioning and malfunctioning machinery, and to get like an optimal grip on both of those, like, I'm using like the left and right visual field, be coordinated in depth. That stereoscopic, like when that happens, and I'm lucky enough to be with an amazing woman who affords me getting glimpses of that. And I have amazing friends too. But like I said, like when I get glimpses of it, when I'm in that place, there's a sense of ontonormativity. This is really real. This is really real. And then when I'm away from it, at least what I have, again, I'm not claiming any right? But what I find I've got at least now, when I can remember it, sati, when I can really remind myself, it gives me a touchstone, because then I know when I'm away from that. Right. It's like, right. Oh, what's coming now is really intense, and I'm very angry, or I'm very scared. But at least I know, I'm getting I hope, I think I've got good reason to believe, I have good reason to hope. It's giving me a sense of, but I'm away from this, and this is more real, and this is where more can be realized.
Yes, totally. And so you have that touchstone. To me, there's some things that make that touchstone more realizable more of the time.
More touchable.
More touchable. Yeah. And it comes back to some of the things I was saying earlier, which is, the flow state and getting beyond the ego. Like, the ego seems to be the thing that gets in the way quite often. Is it takes our attention away from the present, and it will get righteous, and it will get angry and defend itself and our right.
It loves self-righteousness, because self-righteousness is the way you marshal, external resources to help with your pain and your hunger. Yeah, for sure. And I fall prey to that, for sure. I guess for me, I'm trying to get to the place where and this is what I'm learning from IFS, where I can acknowledge the legitimate self-preserving, autopoietic aspects that the ego is tapping into. Try to
Mm.
acknowledge, yes, you're trying to do something here. I get it. But can you see that, if you'll allow me a slogan, that adapting is better than avoiding? Can you see that? Can you begin to see that? And I try to use my more mindful state of mind as a mirror by which that part can reflect to itself and start to see that there's other possibilities for it, if that means any sense to you.
Yes. No, absolutely. Yeah, and that IFS stuff is rich. There's many models just like IFS, in psychotherapy. I'm also
Oh, I was sorry. I just want, for the purposes of anybody looking. Yeah, there's not just many. They're convergent in a lot of ways. They add plausibility.
Yeah.
So you are trained in. You were going to say?
I was going to say I'm a trained counselor, and so having those models available afford me the ability to connect with my clients and to understand what's going on for them, and to be able to see the different parts playing out. And
can I ask you a question then? Because I have training too.
Yeah.
And the problem is I have not only therapeutic training, I have scientist training, right? Yeah. And so one of the difficulties for me is to bring that inappropriately into an interpersonal relationship, like with my partner, or right? Because it's so easy to confuse that sort of detachment that we're talking about with mindfulness with going into the therapeutic role or going into the scientist role, and then diagnosing and putting yourself sort of outside of the situation, which is very, very different from remaining inside the situation and trying to be ontocentric rather than egocentric. And for me, I confuse those two also a lot. And a lot of like, no, you're not a therapist. Use that machinery, but don't use it as a therapist. You're not right. You're not a scientist here. Don't, use the science if it's helpful, but you're not a scientist in this situation. Does that land with you at all? Do you ever confront that as a challenge sometimes?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I am also very lucky in that my wife is, very open to these kinds of things. She's part of the spiritual community with me. She is looking at herself and developing herself. And our relationship, evolves over time, and we both, I would say, get better at it slowly over time. But absolutely,
slowly over time.
But we get caught all the time, and it's so tempting to step outside of a situation and look at it through the lens of a particular model or a framework to try and get some understanding of it. But what I've actually been trying to do more recently in relationship with my wife is just forget all of that stuff, just kind of park it to the side and just try and be with her, because that's really all that she needs if we're
I'm trying to let it influence me implicitly rather than explicitly. Like there's skills there, but they have to be taken out of those roles and replaced within what's happening. And slowly, like a jagged curve, right? Up and down, like it's like it's like drop by drop, right?
yes, indeed. Yeah. So I mean, to me, one of the things that I find most useful, and that seems to cover a lot of different bases, in that it's multi-act, to use a term that I've heard you use, is the practice of openness, which is essentially just trying to be open and present in the situation that I'm in, be aware of the stuff that's happening for me, be aware of what's happening outside of me, and basically not close down. So if a feeling state comes up that I'm trying to avoid, I notice the avoidance. That to me is the closure, and I try and dissolve the closure if I can. Because the more I can do that, the more I can stay connected in the situation. And if I can stay connected, that gives me a much, much better chance of navigating it skillfully than if I don't.
Yeah, I agree. I'm practicing that. Not anywhere near perfection or anything like that. I am practicing that. the other thing that I'm helping is the openness and the connectedness. So when attachment, I don't mean it in the Buddhist sense, I mean it in the psychological sense. When attachment issues come up, um, I try to see through the layering. You know, here's the anger, and then underneath is the sadness, but here's the fear.
Yes.
And then it's like, okay, what would be a like, so you actually want to be connected to this, you're actually afraid, right? You're afraid of,
Mm.
well, instead of being angry at them or sad and withdrawn, like be opened, like you have to make yourself vulnerable, like and you know, be request from the person that they connect with you.
Yes.
And I know that again sounds trite, but trying to, it's funny how a lot of the sort of more core or base drives often want sort of very basic
Yes.
kinds of actions on your part that
Yes.
you'd seem, when you describe them sort of theoretically, they seem so trivial. Well,
Yeah.
you just want a hug from the other person, surely that's not going to be enough. Well, if you just hugged them, no. If you hugged them while you were in an angry, sad, reactive state of mind, it's not going to do anything. But if you can get to the base, then that basic activity can be deeply, deeply, right, adaptively healing. It can really help to ameliorate the fear in what I feel like is an appropriate manner.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And it also allows me, hopefully, to hear the other person's fears,
Yes.
and what
Yes.
they're afraid of, and to
Yeah.
try and become more responsive to them.
Yes, but that even that requires a tremendous amount of awareness because you mentioned the anger, the sadness, the fear in the
Yeah,
layers. To
yeah.
have the awareness in the present moment, I'm feeling angry, but underneath my anger right now is a lot of sadness, and even deeper than that is a fear that I'm going to be abandoned or whatever. I'm going to lose connection. To have that is that requires some work and
Oh,
some self
yeah.
reflection and some self understanding to get to that
So,
point.
you know, you know, I had training in EFT, motion focused therapy, and then I've had decades of the mindfulness. But even so, in this particular sort of, I don't know what to call it, situation I've been working through, what I just said is the result of like 8 to 9 months of work.
Yeah, yeah,
Right? And I'm not claiming that that will work in some other situation over here.
sure,
That's more.
sure.
But what I just said was like 8 months of trying to get to that place that we're both talking about.